Good evening, everybody. My name is Tom Puryear, and I'm the current education chairperson for the New Jersey State Conference NAACP. I want to welcome you to our presentation this evening. We are very excited as we know what we know that our presenter is going to give us an awful lot of information that will be helpful to us as we proceed in developing and promoting Amistad. It is our sincere hope that Dr. Edwards will provide you with information on what you can do to ensure that your school district will implement the Amistad legislation. Shortly, our Vice Chairperson, Ms. Sandra Massey, will introduce our guest presenter this evening. During the presentation, I will be monitoring the chat, so please place any questions that you may have for Dr. Edwards in the chat, and at the end of the presentation, I will bring them up and we can have a dialogue at that particular moment in time. The presentation will take about 45 minutes to an hour. Once the presentation has ended, our question and answer period will begin. We have no doubt that you'll be given tools and information that will bring the Amistad legislation to your school districts. Ms. Massey, it's all yours.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, NAACP members and distinguished guests. Welcome to an evening with Dr. Lillie Johnson Edwards, hosted by the NAACP New Jersey State Conference Education Committee. I'm Sandra Masso, Vice Chairperson of the Education Committee, and it is my distinct pleasure to moderate this evening's event entitled, How Local Residents Can Promote and Monitor Implementation of New Jersey's Mandatory Amistad Curriculum. We are honored to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Lillie Johnson Edwards, Professor Emerita, History and African American Studies at Drew University in Madison, New Jersey. Dr. Edwards served as the founding director of Pan-African Studies and Director American Studies for 23 years before retiring in 2016. Dr. Edwards is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Oberlin College and currently serves on its board of trustees. She received her doctorate in U.S. Southern History, African History, and African Literature from the University of Chicago. It is my honor to introduce Lillie, affectionately called Lillie, to our audience today. Welcome. Let's give her a round of applause, please.
Thank you so very much. It is, as I said to Tom, my honor and privilege to be here. I am with my NAACP family, so please feel free to call me Lillie, but if you're like some of my students who are now in their 40s, they still call me doctor. So whatever makes you comfortable. I am here with my NAACP family because my mother gave me an NAACP membership as a gift when I graduated from college. And I decided in honor of her and in honor of the work I know went on in Columbus, Georgia, as well as that around the entire country, that I would sustain a life membership with the NAACP, and I am quite proud of that. And therefore, I'm at home, and it is an honor to provide a little bit of time and service to your work. I'm going to screen share now for the PowerPoint part of the presentation. Let me start with a story, and I'm glad there are members of the Elizabeth community on this at this workshop. In December 2019, I was part of a community-sponsored event led by Reverend Britt at Mount Teman AME Church in Elizabeth. And it was an event to bring the entire community together into the worship space as community space, to talk about the Elizabeth School District and the need to implement the inclusion and infusion of Black folk into the curriculum. I spoke for only about 15 or 20 minutes. That's all the NAACP gave me that time. And other people spoke as well. Out of that 15 to 20 minute talk, I received a phone call the following week from the supervisor of social studies for the Elizabeth School District. And he said something like this: the superintendent was at the presentation. He heard the things you said and the list you gave of the things we should do. We can do that. Can you help me figure out kind of the plan for how we can launch? And Elizabeth launched. And I begin with that story just as a indicator of, if nothing else, that I am a optimistic woman of hope and faith. And I wanted to use that to signal that there are districts that want to do this work. There are districts that are seeking assistance in doing this work. If you ask me, are all 675 plus school districts in the state of New Jersey seeking that help and assistance to launch and to serve their children better by creating an inclusive education? I would say no, it is not all 600 something districts. But at least my experience with the school districts with whom I've worked that have been districts that are very diverse and districts that are barely diverse at all, has been that there are teachers, administrators, and school boards who are interested in doing this work. And so one approach that we might take is to figure out what is the support, what is the empowerment that we can give to districts and especially to the classroom school teacher in getting this work done. And what I hope to do tonight then is to present ways in which all of us as citizens, as community stakeholders, as people who care about and love our children and who want the best for them, who want educational excellence for them, know that an inclusive curriculum is good for our children and necessary, as I will talk about later, necessary for their future. These are the areas I'm going to cover tonight, and I have my phone right next to me so I can see the clock. I will stay on schedule, and Tom, just in case, I put in 2 different thank you slides at 2 different slots so I could cut it short if I needed to. It's very important for us to be able to have a fulsome discussion, and so what I hope to do is to provide for you the platform for a more fulsome discussion so we can move from talking to action. This is the outline I will be using tonight. First, I want to talk about the New Jersey Amistad legislation. I hope you are aware that brand new legislation was just signed by the governor in January 2021. I have realized that most school districts have no idea there's new legislation, which is a major problem. Then we'll look at implementation and accountability on the part of the school district and the school board. We will look at some models of inclusive excellence, school districts that are actually doing the work, Elizabeth among them. We will look at implementation and accountability on the school district, not on the district level, on the school level. In other words, what is a principal and the administration at a given school doing, and then we'll take it down to the level of the classroom teacher. And then I will talk about community and stakeholder expectations and responsibilities. I would like to end with a little bit on race, politics, and education. It's the elephant in the room we can't ignore when there are people nationwide, and I'm sure people in New Jersey as well, who will purport somehow that to include Black and brown people in the curriculum is somehow an un-American act. And we want to be empowered to refute that in some ways, in ways that are not even arguable. And I want to give you some tools for those arguments as well, and then we will have Q&A. So let's get started. We begin with the New Jersey Amistad, bill. that was drafted by the former mayor of Willingboro, LaVon B. Blur Johnson, and myself as, at the time, commissioners of the Amistad Commission. I am no longer a member of that commission, but one of the last things I did that I'm very proud of is to work on the draft of this new bill. It was signed into law by Governor Murphy in January 2021, and now stands as a requirement for every school district in the state of New Jersey. So one of the things we can all do as stakeholders is make sure our districts actually know that this new version of the bill exists. It is, as I will go through some major points from that bill, because what the Honorable former Mayor Johnson and I tried to do was to put some specificity and teeth into this new version, to give it some clarity, and in some ways to create a roadmap within the legislation itself that districts could clearly or more clearly see what was expected of them. So one of the things that this new bill does is describe what inclusion means. And it is defined as infusing all courses in the United States. So it means, in other words, if a teacher in any area of study, in any field, any discipline, includes the United States, that Black people in the United States have to be part of that landscape. It also requires that African Americans be included in every area of study. And you see here this kind of very broad list we have included to make sure teachers didn't assume that somehow they could include Black people when they're talking about civil rights, but they would not include Black people when they talk about medicine and science, right? And so we've included everything from industry and military to math, science, culture, architecture. We also wanted to be specific about the content knowledge. One of the things that I am especially committed to is ensuring that Black people are included in the history of the founding of the 13 North American colonies, and in fact, also included in the periods of exploration with the Spanish conquistadors. And so we have included here that slavery and freedom are part of the nation's history, that people of the African diaspora have impacted and shaped what America is, America's culture, American institutions, and that this has occurred throughout all of the history of the nation from its colonial beginnings. We also have embedded into the legislation a language that recognizes the historic and systemic racism of America. And so the language in the bill says that inequality is a consequence of prejudice and discrimination in the pursuit of maintaining power and dominance. It describes for teachers and school districts what inequality is. And it also points to the importance in civics and in developing our children as responsible, engaged citizens, to the importance of citizenship and the importance of the right to vote as a right of citizenship. This part of the legislation that you see on your screen now includes excerpts taken directly from the New Jersey Holocaust education legislation. And we did this for several reasons. One is that you want the kind of foundational values of this legislation to be aligned with other mandates that teachers have. And so it isn't that one mandate is asking for a certain kind of approach to teaching and learning, and another mandate is asking for something totally different. But rather we wanted teachers and schools to see that this particular language is consistent when you're teaching our children about all human beings. that we're teaching them always about issues of moral dilemma and conscience because human beings are so imperfect. We're teaching them about the importance of personal and civic development that human beings have, that we have a responsibility to our society. And we know from history that our responsibilities to each other have not always been recognized or implemented. We want to focus for students on their personal responsibility to fight racism and hatred as part of a national ideal. One of the most profound ways I have experienced in presenting this information to people is to highlight two of the most preeminent historians, my own former professor from the University of Chicago, the late John Hope Franklin, who wrote the first African-American textbook From Slavery to Freedom in 1947. It has been translated into dozens of languages worldwide. But it is Franklin's a quote that's at the bottom of this page that I especially wanted to bring to your attention. And he wrote about this 1947 kind of groundbreaking work From Slavery to Freedom that is still being used in classrooms in 2021. And he said, my challenge was to weave into the fabric of American history enough of the presence of Blacks so that the story of the United States could be told adequately and fairly. I think this quote summarizes the whole point of the Amistad legislation and the work that needs to be done in our classrooms. One of the things we can ask, for example, if we look at Franklin's quote is, what does it look like for this legislation to succeed in the classroom? Is it a quantifiable measure where we can say a certain number of districts fulfill a certain criteria? Or is it the number of teachers in a school district that are trained and know this content? And what I would suggest to you, either the NAACP as it looks statewide, or individuals in this workshop that are looking at your own particular school district, that I have not seen anywhere except in some of the model districts where there actually has been created some sort of measure to assess whether or not those goals are being met. And we'll talk about this kind of meeting goals and measures throughout this talk. What I would like us to do now is to look specifically at the school district and school board level. And you can tell by the outline I gave you at the beginning that I'm starting at this macro level of looking at the policy and decision makers, and then moving down to the principal and school level, and then into the classroom. And what I will suggest to you is that only when all of these levels are fully invested in this work can the work be truly successful. That makes sense, right? You can have, and you probably do have, I've always said this since I joined the commission back in 2002. In 2002, I said, there are school teachers doing this work already all over the state of New Jersey. We just don't know they're doing it. And for some of them, they're doing that work with no support. No support from a principal, no support from the school district, maybe no support from their community. They're teaching an inclusive curriculum because they know it's the right thing to do. We also know that a school board can pass all sorts of regulations and then nothing is happening in the classroom. And so what I want to do is to be able to touch on all of these layers of both decision-making and implementation, okay? I hope that makes sense. And it also means that you, as a community stakeholder, you're always thinking through to what do I hold the district and the board accountable, to what do I hold the principal accountable, to what do I hold the teacher accountable, and creating a slightly different approaches and strategies to approach people at those different levels. And I hope that makes sense. So one of the things I have discovered, as I said earlier, that school boards and superintendents are asking question after question after question about what should I be doing? How should I do it? Very similar to what happened at Elizabeth. On October 22nd, 2020, I did a presentation to the New Jersey School Board Association, along with two other people who are committed to this work, including James Harris, who most of you know from the NAACP. And what I saved from that conversation were the chat questions, right? Because they indicate to us what at that macro level board members are seeking, and in some ways don't have answers to these kinds of questions. They asked about textbooks. They asked about needing training from the commission and didn't know where to go to get PD training for their teachers. They asked about instructional strategies for different grade levels. They asked about what was the strategy of the Amistad Commission to do statewide work and infusion. They asked about the 1619 project, and they asked whether or not the curriculum was being implemented into the social studies curriculum. So these are questions from the school board and the School Board Association. What you're looking at now is the list very similar to, probably the same as the one I presented to Elizabeth at that meeting in Mount Teman. Actually, I created it for that meeting, and I have used it over and over and over again in every presentation, because it occurred to me, and I think my conclusions have been validated and affirmed, that many districts do not know literally what to do. So even if they know, especially the old legislation, if they know that it's supposed to be inclusive, right? They know African Americans are supposed to be part of the school work of children. They aren't quite sure kind of what does that look like? And what actual steps do we take? And so what I developed here, this is my own list. It is not an Amistad Commission list. So I take credit for it, good or bad. But it is the list of what I developed as the minimal indicators. In other words, these are the things that a school board should have in place if they have nothing else. There should be a resolution or a bylaw on adopting and implementing an inclusive curriculum. The reason for this is by creating a resolution or a bylaw, the school board has made a public statement that you may hold them accountable to implementing what they have now said publicly, and it's now part of the record. The other thing that you should see your school district doing is assessing and revising the curriculum. And so even if, I would say, even a model district like Elizabeth is continually doing that work of assessing and revising the curriculum. It may mean that a district brings in someone from the outside, like some districts have done. Other districts have put their own teachers, which is in some ways my preferred model, has put their own teachers around the table and brought in an outside facilitator to work with the teaching staff to do that curricular work themselves. There needs to also be ongoing professional development and training and workshops for teachers and administrators in content and pedagogy. And the reason for this is twofold. One is many teachers have not received an inclusive content in their own education, in their own college education, and definitely not in their teacher education. Some have, but you can probably guess that many have had no course in African American history, literature, music, African American and African economics, culture, etc. So we're filling in just the subject matter for many teachers. And also, I think, given what we all now can affirm about the heavy load that teachers carry and the way we depend on them to really cultivate and nurture the next generation, I think that the community really does have a responsibility to bear in helping them fill in this content gap. And I'll say more about that later as well. The other thing that needs to happen is that the supervisor or principal in reviewing teacher lesson plans needs to look for that inclusion and help a teacher where the gap is there. And then finally, as you may know, the NJSC is required to now include the Amistad criteria tied directly to the legislation for schools to fulfill that requirement. School districts, principals, social studies supervisors themselves have said to me, that's not enough. And so I want us again to see this as this list I've presented to you as the minimum. And I will talk about the model districts who have gone much farther than this in ensuring that Black people are infused throughout the curriculum. Here's another example of something that you might do, and that is, we can't really evaluate something where we don't have the data, right? If we don't have the information. And so you and I need to have the data on school districts' current understanding of, commitment to, and their work on inclusive curriculum. And these are the kind of questions then you can ask at the different levels that I mentioned earlier. You can ask about the existing NJSC scores. You can ask about the resolution and bylaws and whether or not those statements are made public. We'll talk about that more later. You can look at the hiring practice and the teacher assessments. Are teachers being assessed on how well they have created an inclusive curriculum? And then you can assess how much professional development is going on. There's one school district that I worked with this past fall, and their first statement to me was, this is not a one-off single professional development session. We know that we need to put in a year, maybe 2 years of professional development work because we want to get this right. We do not want to just check a box and say, Dr. Lillie Edwards came in and talked to us and our work is over. And so this is the kind of data you can collect to first find out what has your district already done. Here are some examples of going beyond that minimum list I just gave you. So one of the things that one district has done is to go beyond the curriculum. And instead, what they did was a full DEI assessment by an outside consultant that looked at teachers, looked at staff, looked at the students, looked at hiring, looked at curriculum, athletics, clubs, every aspect of diversity, equity, inclusion for that school district. And then the district is now moving toward addressing all of the problems and gaps that were identified. And this DEI report that points out all the problems is on their website for the entire public to see. Some schools are working in partnership and collaboration with community stakeholders. I hold Elizabeth up again as the exemplar of the community stakeholders actually being part of the communication lines between the community and the school board. Districts are, some districts in hiring of teachers have explicitly said that superintendents are going to ask new teachers about both their experience and then their willingness to be trained in teaching an inclusive curriculum. Some districts are also trying to, I think, are very smart in trying to craft a message and framing the issue for the public so that the public doesn't run off into these kind of political forays and political, hostility about the inclusion of Black people. And then finally, I highly recommend, if your town has done this already, is a kind of town hall presentation. It's the kind of thing I did and Elizabeth could do for you as well. And I've done it for West Orange with the invitation from Tom. But a presentation that kind of gives the explanation of what the legislation is. And I would suggest, it's something I did not do in Elizabeth, but I have done it in my Zoom presentations to school districts, and a sample lesson so that parents and teachers and stakeholders see what inclusion looks like. And if we have time tonight, I will do a little bit of showing you how those lessons can be crafted for the schoolroom. No one should know better than the NAACP the power of community partners and stakeholders. And so I just wanted to indicate to you how vast the list is of people who could partner with a school district in getting this work done, because most of these community partners I've listed here, and you see the ones where I have an asterisk, are already doing the work. The New Jersey Council on Social Studies has a video on Amistad. They've done Amistad workshops. I mentioned the New Jersey School Board Association. I've done Amistad presentations for the League of Women Voters. The National Park Service in Washington headquarters is completely re-changing the way Washington is framed at the National Park Service, at those headquarters, to include the enslaved people he brought with them. The National State Bar Foundation did a workshop, created a curriculum around the legislation, and worked with school teachers for a year in creating that. Of course, the NAACP, museums, historical societies, public libraries. One of the suggestions, in fact, that I have made to the Amistad Commission is that the kind of statewide infusion of this work really already exists. If you look at this list, right, of partners and stakeholders, it really does cover the entire state. And one of the, I think, a possible strategy for that, statewide coverage of 600 something school districts, which initially seems overwhelming and almost impossible with a small staff. Even if you doubled the staff, it would still be small. But these community partners are already out there. They're in your cities, they're in the county, multiple ones, right? Sitting in one place that could begin to do a lot of this professional development work, and they're doing it already anyway. So this is something I think that the NAACP and you as individuals in your own community should really push and see who is already doing this work that could kind of come to the table and work together as a consortia and leverage those partnerships. Let's look at the school districts that are doing the work. I just have a small list. That doesn't mean there aren't dozens more doing the work, but these are some of the school districts I know the best. I've mentioned to you already, Elizabeth, you can go onto their website and see their work. I just started working with Glen Ridge Public Schools, who are so committed that when they had me come in as a keynote, they didn't just have those teachers. And nor did they just have social studies and English teachers, which is more typical. They had every teacher in the district, K through 12. They had the staff, counselors, and other personnel. The principals of the schools were on there, and the superintendent of schools was on this at this presentation. And they are planning to do a really deep dive. And what you see here is the link to their DEI assessment. Hoboken schools have been led by their superintendent in doing this work. And she, in fact, has been so committed to the work, not just in Hoboken, but she actually has kind of gone on the road and spoken to other school districts. Montclair Public Schools also have a statement within their kind of resolution on inclusive curriculum, and one of the Montclair members, Sandra Cook McKnight, and I talked with the head of social studies and DEI in Montclair about their work, which they had not publicized. And so we were hearing this long list of work that's being done, and I asked, is there a report? And there isn't. But that is the kind of thing that the NAACP and other stakeholders should ask, to see some sort of documentation of what the work is. Newark Public Schools similarly have done a revision of their curriculum some years ago based upon the existing legislation. North Plainfield, I just started working with them, and it's been a wonderful experience. They understand what the infusion actually means and the amount of work that it will entail for teachers. Roselle also has on their website curricular changes and revisions they have made, as does Union, as you can see, has K-12 Amistad curriculum resources on their website. Moving ahead for stakeholders, this is the kind of information you should ask for in a data-driven action plan. How many teachers and principals have done the PD work? For example, you should know if the school district has had professional development training. You should know how many teachers from your school district have gone to an Amistad Summer Institute. You want to know if there are, I don't know, a dozen, 2 dozen teachers over the last 10 years have gone to the Amistad Summer Institute. You want to know not only that the district supported those individual teachers, but you want to know, did in fact those teachers coming back into the district have an impact on their entire school or the district itself? In other words, was there a ripple effect created from teachers going to Amistad or other professional development opportunities? You want to look at what local, county, state, and national resources are available. In some ways that points us back to the partnerships, right? Kind of, what's your local library doing? What is your local historical society doing? Do you have an African-American historical society in your town that actually is doing a local history in particular? Can you take advantage of museums and museum exhibits? And you see here, again, that list of libraries, universities, and also other agencies. Let's look at the school level next. More than anything else, as you know, the principal is going to be the key person who needs to be aware of what teachers are doing in their classroom and what is in those lesson plans and what is being implemented. Most school districts will post the curriculum on the school website. I've realized that some actually don't do that, so you may have to actually ask for that curriculum. I've also learned something else that I'd like to warn you about. I've also learned from a school teacher that a particular teacher in the school is not teaching the curriculum as written by the district, and that curriculum is inclusive, but the teacher is ignoring those requirements. That's a slightly deeper dive. I'll talk about that as well in terms of that teacher level. But here we're talking about the school and the school's curriculum. We also want to be aware that programming for events for the school, which is wonderful, and the co-curricular inclusive piece is important, but it is not a substitute for the school work in the classroom. And here, let me pause to say something briefly about Dr. Carter G. Woodson, father of African-American history and the founder of Negro History Week in 1926. We do not want to defame the the legacy of Dr. Woodson, who was at the forefront of that fight to say Black humanity required the study of Black history. And it is Woodson who created the entire platform for the serious scholarship to occur, for the inclusion of the Black community and the creation of branches of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History within the Black community, within Black churches. And he is rightly credited for creating that foundation. And Negro History Week, as well as the Journal of Negro History, now the Journal of African American History, still published. The association is still doing the work. The association is still doing K through 12 curriculum development. And so we do not want to detract from the power of Carter G Woodson being this pioneer and doing the kind of work we are still talking about trying to get implemented in the 21st century. We move down to the classroom. This is what you should see, or at least these are some of the kinds of things you should see. You should see Black people infused in your children's schoolwork throughout the entire year, September through June. You should not see Black people framed as victims, but you also don't want to see a rosy colored picture that is devoid of the realities of racism. And so one of the skills a teacher will need, and I think this is what's needed in some of the professional development, is how do you walk that thin line, right? Between saying slavery was horrific, the enslavement of Black people was terrorism, it was horrific, it was traumatizing, but at the same time talk about the almost infinite ability of human beings to continue to have family, to continue to have children, to continue to have culture in music and song, and the ability of human beings to resist and rebel. We need a focus then on agency, autonomy, creativity, and intellect of Black people, because it's so easy to assume that if somebody's enslaved, they don't have any of those things. But of course, we know from history that people, human beings under the worst of circumstances, enslavement being one of them, have enormous agency and resilience and autonomy and claim themselves, even if other people are calling them slaves who were owned as property. We also, as we know, Black folk have a wide range of diversity, just like all other human beings. And so we don't want teachers to kind of say the Black people, right? Because there is no such thing within our own Black humanity that is any one thing. That in itself is a racial construction. And then finally, teachers can be so creative in showing the intersections of culture and politics and economics and the social, material artifacts to talk about the power of Black women quilting and what that means in terms of both community and also material production and creativity and a Black aesthetic. Another way that you might see teachers infuse Black people into the curriculum is what I call a zoom in and zoom out. So zoom in means you're looking specifically at Black people for the purpose of understanding something about a Black person or an event or a place. Autobiography and biography would be examples of that, or looking at something specific to Black culture. So Harlem Renaissance, right, would be zoom in. You can also zoom out. And I want everyone to understand that you may also see this zoom out and that the zoom out is also useful. And what that means is you're very intentionally, a teacher is intentionally looking at Africans and African Americans as part of a broader national or international landscape. So for example, if you're talking about early human civilizations, that is not only Africa and Egypt and ancient Zimbabwe and Nubia, et cetera. It is part of the teaching of global history, right? If you're talking about the US Constitution, And the point is for students to understand that Constitution. We know that embedded in there is a national affirmation and protection of the enslavement of Black people. So again, the topic, zoom in, is not Black people. The topic is the US Constitution, and Black people are there. American wars would be the same thing. New Deal is a really good example where people very often don't think about the New Deal, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and what Black people are doing as they lose farmland in the South because of the New Deal. Or post-World War II America. I do a lecture on the Garden State Plaza Mall as one of the first malls in America, and how it actually was constructed to keep Black people in the city out of that mall. Let's look at some examples of the ways that curriculum then is also wedded to the social studies standards. Remember, that is another measure that teachers and schools have to meet, will be the standards. And so I've borrowed these slides from Hank Bitton, with his permission, of the New Jersey Council for Social Studies that he gave as part of a presentation on Amistad. And what I did was to add what I call African-American inclusion, the AA inclusion you see here. So when he talks about including the impact of ideas and inventions and prominent figures in New Jersey, I have added 3 Black inventors who are all from New Jersey. The light bulb filament, the railway communications technology, and rehabilitation technology. When Hank talks about using aerial photography and satellite images, an example of what one could use is to show how I-280 segmented Newark Black communities and the negative impact on Black communities from that interstate highway. And you actually could show this all over the country, how interstate highways bifurcated the Black community. Hank talks about here voting rights in the Jacksonian period, and he has voting rights, right, that did expand to all white males, universal white male suffrage. An African-American inclusive question would say, how does freedom expand and the enslavement of Black people expand at the same time? And why does that occur? And what are Black leaders saying about freedom and citizenship and enslavement? I'll give you one last example, and that is Hank talks about the importance of education reform and women's rights in the 19th century. And I added, one could talk about the importance of literacy for free Black people in the North, and the importance of newspapers and the first Black schools in the North, and the Black women's rights activists. And the last one here points to something that is more the zoom in, is the inclusion of the Great Migration, how it changes American cities, and of course, the impact of the Harlem Renaissance. One of the places where I think we kind of skim the history of Black people is the civil rights movement itself, which so centers Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. It doesn't leave space for the mass movement and for students to see ordinary people having the power to change their lives. So in sum, we want to see what teachers have already done with this work. We want to see what the teacher-driven assessments and revisions, perhaps with a facilitator, can show us about new work, or bring in a consultant in to do the review. And one of the things I recommend that came up in one of my presentations is districts need to share the curricular work, which is one of the reasons why you want the work on the district's website, so other districts can have access to it. You want to make sure your school district's development and training isn't a one-shot deal, that it is ongoing and continual, and there are just so many places for this PD work to be done. There is no reason at all to depend upon the Amistad Commission to provide PD training for the entire state. I mean, it's not feasible, right? But there are so many other places that professional development work can be done. And then we will end with looking at implementation accountability on the part of the commission itself. And I will have, here's a list that I think we could all agree would be helpful for the Amistad Commission and other state agencies as well. Number one, we should be able to get data collection on district work from the commission and other state agencies. We should be able to see a summer institute that's aligned with the learning outcomes and standards. And I have a short slide on that. We need to completely ask the commission to completely revamp and change the web-based curriculum, because there are other sites on African-American curriculum that are far superior to what New Jersey is currently offering. We need statewide coordination and cooperation. So school districts don't need to start from ground zero. You don't need to start your stakeholder work from ground zero, because so much work is already done. I have been a strong advocate, as you heard me say earlier in the very beginning, for rewarding districts, at least recognize them, at least, have a certificate, have a press release, and say that this district and these teachers are doing great work. Partnerships for major grants. There have been no major grants done by the New Jersey Amistad Commission. The New Jersey Education Association is in the process now of trying to do a major multi-year grant. But those are the kinds of grants where you can have a really big impact and have the funding for that impact over several years. One of the things the commission has talked about is the state of New Jersey does not require coursework on inclusive content for teacher certification. Of course, that makes no sense. Why are we doing PD work with teachers after they're certified and didn't ask them to do the work up front? And then finally, the commission is already working on establishing Amistad centers at colleges and universities, similar to kind of replicating the work done by Holocaust and Genocide Studies centers. And then finally, I wanted to show you an actual slide on the Amistad Summer Institute to show the ways in which that institute needs to be aligned with what teachers actually have to do in the classroom in terms of content knowledge. How do they teach that content knowledge? How do they do the curriculum development when they go back to their schools, and continue in some ways the kind of teachers teaching and working with their colleagues. Let me say just a little bit. I have about two minutes or so, I guess, for my hour time. Let me just say a little bit about race, politics, and education. And I've written this out to try and get it, kind of organize it in my own head. So we all know that throughout the news media, there are school districts and sometimes entire states that are saying you shouldn't teach about Black people, you shouldn't teach about enslavement. And one of the things modern psychology tells us is that for most of these people, you're not going to convince them to do anything differently by appealing to morals, ethics, values, we're all human beings kind of speech. I know that's, very disheartening, but modern psychology says people really don't respond to that. What people do respond to is self-interest. And so I propose that we actually use that. Number one, that we use a language in talking about race, politics, and education that actually draws from the Declaration, that actually draws from the US Constitution, because it makes it really much harder for people to argue against a position that says we do believe that all human beings are created equal and that they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. I don't think anyone's going to say that's not true. We can also argue from a standpoint of history that we are in the business of creating a more perfect union, which is what the preamble to our Constitution says, because they really did not create a very good political system to start with the Articles of Confederation. I mean, our nation was founded on a grand mistake that did not work at all, which is why we got a brand new Constitution. And that is flawed clearly, because it affirms, supports, and protects the enslavement of human beings. So I argue that the kind of politics of this moment in terms of inclusive education should actually use the national documents themselves as the argument. And then finally, the other argument on self-interest is that we want to have our children educated to interact with a world of 8 billion people. No one can argue about us being in an age where our children are connected in a nanosecond with people all over the planet, right? Our children do not know for whom they will work, with whom they will work, what vendor they will hire, what vendor will hire them, what soldier or sailor or Marine they will be fighting with. And if our children have absolutely no knowledge, no experience, no understanding of other people, they will be crippled in dealing with the world or dealing with the diversity within the United States itself. They will be crippled at work. They will be crippled in terms of just interacting socially with the rest of humanity. We cannot pretend with our children that the rest of humanity doesn't exist. Rather, we are preparing them to be empowered with the rest of humanity. And if we don't teach them the knowledge and respect for the rest of humanity, what does it say about teaching them the respect and recognition of themselves and their own identity and their own values and their own heritage? Thank you so very much, my friends, for your commitment to the children of New Jersey. I will stop here and we'll take any questions you have in the chat, or I assume our moderators will may ask you to unmute and share your questions with us.
Thank you, Lillie. Thank you for delineating the goals and objectives of the Amistad curriculum. We really appreciated the strategies that you shared with us today to enable the community to encourage local school districts to provide techniques to successfully implement the Amistad curriculum. We greatly appreciate your time this evening. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tom because we do have a few questions. Tom?
Thank you, Sandra. Lillie, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for the presentation, but more importantly, thank you for the presentation and allowing us to record it. It is going to be an excellent tool for us to be able to carry and share with others throughout the state of New Jersey. And by the way, when you go back into the classroom to teach, please let me know so I can sign up for one of your courses, please. As Sandra said, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I have a couple of questions here. Lillie, what New Jersey colleges and or universities are partnering in promoting the Amistad effort?
I believe, Tom, you may be able to answer this question better than I can, because I just saw the information in the Amistad Executive Director's report. I believe it talks about Rutgers Camden, am I correct, is one of the institutions. I know that Amistad had been working in the past also with Stockton as well. And my understanding is these efforts are just getting started, that nothing has been, no MOUs have been signed.
I'm going to turn to Reverend Britt for a second, assuming Reverend Britt is still on. Reverend Britt, if you want to respond to that, we had a recent conversation and you mentioned another school.
Yeah, well, I would like to thank Dr. Edwards for the presentation and just simply share that Dr. Kelly Harris of Seton Hall University was kind enough to identify a student at Seton Hall University to serve as an intern to support our collaborative. So I would say Dr. Kelly Harris and Seton Hall University are strong advocates, and also encourage all who are gathered here to connect with the colleges and universities in their area and to engage students from the college in the collaborative process.
Thank you, Reverend Britt. Dr. Lillie, Dr. Edwards, you mentioned that, again, with Elizabeth, there was someone who came in to assist the school district with the review of their curriculum. How are there sufficient resources in our community for that to occur?
So it's just a matter of reaching out. And so, for example, the DEI work that Glen Ridge has just started, they actually reached out to a Black-owned company that actually does this comprehensive assessment. And I believe they do have tools to also do the curricular piece, but they were looking at kind of what do you need to fix kind of question. But I think here's the thing about the resources for schools and districts to do this curricular work. One of the most underutilized resources are master teachers themselves. Number one, there are teachers, as you know, Tom, right, who have been to 2, 3, 4 Amistad Summer Institutes. There are teachers who early on received awards from Amistad for their curricular work. There are school districts, even some of those that I've listed, clearly that have teachers who are doing the work, who actually did their own curriculum revisions. And so one of the things I did for Elizabeth was to say, especially since they wanted to have someone who actually looked at every course to see what was going on in those courses, I recommended to them a master's school teacher who taught those courses in their own district and had already done those revisions and could identify the gaps for Elizabeth. My guess is that if one of the things Amistad could do, for example, is to create that kind of body of both the classroom teacher professionals. You also can bring in people like me. You can bring in the African American and US history scholars to do the content piece. My joke to all the school districts is, don't ask me about 4th grade. I liked my own children when they were in 4th grade, but I have no clue what to do with a room full of 4th graders. Bring in an elementary school teacher, bring in Sandra Cook McKnight for that one, right? But I think we you know, I don't want to get on my little lectern here and talk about how we don't respect school teachers as professionals, but that is one of my pet peeves. It is so obvious to me, you know, why aren't teachers regarded as the experts? And especially those who are trained. There are teachers who have had the African-American history and African-American literature as undergraduates, who actually know their stuff and are doing it in the classroom kind of seamlessly and easily. I talked to one school district and I was presenting on the inclusion of African empires and stuff, right, Tom? And so one of the teachers starts talking about, well, when I'm doing, you know, the world civilizations, I do Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, and I talk about Mansa Musa, and we have, you know, ancient Zimbabwe, and she's just going through, I do Nubia, and you know, she's going through all this. A colleague of hers who just started teaching says, I am not as informed about any of this, and I have only just started, right? So that's the kind of gap that we need to fill in. And the teacher who's, you know, the teacher who was talking was, for the most part, the things I talked about, she was already doing it, right? And so I think we have missed a major resource, kind of pay school teachers as the consultants to other school teachers. The other thing is, right, they're more likely to listen to a colleague.
Thank you. I have an interesting comment, a question from a local Board of Education member. It's a two-part question. Are there any partnerships with historical Black colleges to support the implementation of the Amistad curriculum? And the other question is Dr. Edwards available to make presentation to my school board?
Sure, I'll make a presentation, school board. In fact, I'll put my email address in the chat, and let me make sure it's going to everyone. And
If not,
so,
don't worry about it. I mean, please try, but the individual is Lorenzo Richardson from Jersey City, and I will put you two
Okay.
together.
Sure. HBCUs. Well, the first thing that comes to mind, and I'm not sure I put it in the list, and it was a real oversight on my part. One partner one could consider would be the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. That has always done K through 12 curriculum since Carter G Woodson started it. So that would be a partner, and ASALH, as you can imagine, is inextricably linked to many of the HBCUs, and especially Howard, where its offices are seated at Howard in Washington. I do not know of any specific work being done by any of the HBCUs, but that actually is an excellent question in terms of bringing in additional partners for this work. That would be a kind of another leg to pull in among all those partners. One of the things one could do with HBCUs, obviously, is many of them, especially Howard and Fisk, but also others, Hampton, have phenomenal resources online in terms of getting resources for the classroom and for teaching. And my guess is those archivists and librarians would be very helpful in working with school districts. I don't know of anyone who has actually structured a strategy, which is what I'm recommending here, a strategy for how to pull in the resources of HBCUs. One of the things I will say though, Tom, one of the things that I was asked by a school district was that they needed, and I plan to come to the NAACP and the New Jersey Association of Black Educators. A superintendent asked me, how do we find more Black teachers? We would like to hire more Black teachers. And the pool is really tiny. That may also be an HBCU piece, right? Of actually recruiting intentionally from HBCUs to also increase the number of Black teachers in the classroom in New Jersey.
My next to last question is, what metrics are being used by school districts to measure progress or the lack of thereof by each teacher in teaching or implementing the Amistad curriculum? And part two is, what discipline, what type of penalties is being issued where teachers are refusing to teach the Amistad curriculum?
Two things I'll say there. I think one of the reasons I think the role of the stakeholders and the kind of work Elizabeth is doing, which is so hands-on in terms of looking at everything that's being done, how it's being done, and the community and some of the stakeholders are assessing, is that we really don't know. Yeah. It's one of the things I put into that list for Amistad. The commission has no strategy for that deep dive. And one of the reasons I want us to look at it in this layered way, a school board doesn't know either, right? A school board doesn't know what the individual teacher at this high school 9th grade World Civ is doing. And I know of a district where a world civilizations teacher is teaching in world civ ancient Mesopotamian civilizations, Asia, and Europe. Is not teaching the Americas, no Incas, no Aztecs, and it's not teaching Africa at all. So they aren't teaching 3 continents. And of course, that actually is not consistent with just the New Jersey social studies standards. So the question becomes, the person who would see that would really be a parent at home. I mean, the first person who probably sees that is a parent at home who says, where is Africa? And, you know, where are the indigenous people of the Americas? I don't know how or it would have to be a principal or social studies supervisor, as the person posing the question says, who really is looking for that inclusion, doesn't see it, and that there are repercussions. That is a question everyone should ask their school district. Is it a shrug or oh, you know, so-and-so's gonna just teach the same way they've always been teaching? I mean, is it a shrug or does it matter?
I have a comment here in regards to the question about HBCUs. The statement is, CJ Pride is an organization of K through 12 human resource professionals that are reaching out to HBCUs as part of their educational recruitment efforts. Lillie, my last question, I don't see any more questions in the chat, but I do have something that happened to me today. I received a communication from a local NAACP chapter where a parent was concerned because her 7th grade son was given an assignment to create a plantation by listing the big house, the little house, the slave quarters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is that the type of course presentation you think is affirming the implementation of Amistad?
Probably not. I mean, I would, you know, in my head, I'm trying to think of what was the point, right? Because doing that kind of activity, as is always the case in teaching, doing the activity is never the point, right? You know, you're doing the activity to learn something. I'm having a difficult time wrapping my head around what the student would learn. So I can give you an example of something I had my college students to do, but this is after, you know, they're reading primary sources about, you know, Black families and Black people petitioning and Black people, you know, doing all kind of clandestine stuff on plantations, and, you know, Black people who have different occupations. And so what I had them do was to create a persona, right? They actually had to, in their own minds, like a fiction writer, create a person. And then they had to give the significance of everything they created, right? So if they said, this is a Black man, I would say, what difference does it make that it's a man? He's 30 years old. What difference does that make? It's 1940. What difference does it make? It's 1840. He is, he has a family. Yeah, and you know, so everything they had to kind of dig deeply, and the whole point was to humanize this person who is supposed to be property, is, you know, has the same deep richness of individuality as all human beings do. And so kind of the slave is not a category which identifies anybody, right? It's our humanity that identifies us. But with this particular project in 7th grade, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Big stretch.
Yeah, well, yeah, what I'm lost for is, what is it that the student is supposed to learn? I don't see what that is.
Just to give you a little bit more information, it was a school district in Huntington County. It's predominantly a white school district.
Right.
That was my response to the individual who wanted more information about that.
Here's a better example, Tom. It's amazing how many resources are out there. I mean, it's just enormous once even I start looking, at my age of what is available online as resources for teachers. One of the most wonderful places to find information about plantations is the Mount Vernon website. So the Mount Vernon website has all of these pieces on the enslaved people, including reenactments of people talking about running away and how they're treated at Mount Vernon. And so if you want to get the story of the plantation, there are places where you can hear the voices of Black people themselves, right? Talking about themselves. I'm not sure what how you move from a looking at the configuration of a plantation as a space, how that humanizes Black people in that experience. When there are resources that actually do that, right? I mean, there are resources on Black families, on different occupations of enslaved people, the religion and beliefs of enslaved. I mean, there was just so much that this piece seems odd to me. So
I'm looking at the clock, but there's a couple more questions coming in. But one of my questions, you used the word recently, primary resources. Could you expand upon what you mean by that?
Right. So one of the things that's available to teachers and is some of the most exciting ways to teach and for students to learn is to have sources, original sources from the time period that students are studying. In the words of the people of the time, primary sources may also be the artifacts of the time. And so what's most important is that the material students actually use and study come from the actual time period and the original source. And so one of the things historians have been able to collect over the past, I will say 50 to 60 years, is this enormous body of primary sources by Black people, including enslaved people. Stories, sermons, songs, petitions. There's this enormous number of petitions Black people serve, especially after the revolution. Why? Because Black people understand that revolution probably better than anybody. Take it as an opportunity, like Elizabeth Freeman in Massachusetts, who petitions over and over and over and over again. My enslavement is against the Massachusetts Constitution, right? And so to have this, the power of Black folks' own words spoken by themselves. I did a presentation in Morristown 2 weeks ago and began by quoting David Walker. And everyone in this all-white audience said, "We never heard of him." I said, he's about as revolutionary as you want to hear in 1829. So I think one of the things I didn't say, Tom, that I also think people need to do who care about this work, Black, white, everybody in your own households, with your nieces, nephews, grandnieces, grandnephews, buy them the books to read at home. buy them the books to read at home. Make that diversity part of your own nighttime reading, storytelling, reading together at home. And the number of books available there for children K through 12 is enormous. There's an enormous number of books available.
Lillie, I'm going to make this the last question. I apologize if I didn't get any more.
That's okay.
Two-part. How do you make sure that your school district is looking at lesson plans of the staff, and how can parents reinforce the knowledge at home?
Well, I just, in part, I anticipated the last part of that question, and if you want any help with that, I can offer it. But you really can simply go online and pull up Black literature, Black poetry, Black history, and you can actually put in the appropriate age and grade for your child. And I guarantee you there will be lots of books. If you want me to recommend some to you, I would be happy to do that. I'm sorry?
How can we monitor what the teachers' lesson plans?
A couple of things. One is, I think parents should, I know for many schools, back to school night, right? And I realize we're in a COVID space. I'm not sure what back to school night looks like in a COVID space, but typically back to school night, at least here in Montclair, was you actually get from the teacher, this is the lay of the land for the year. These are my goals. This is what I plan to do. And also get a kind of elementary or high school version of what would really be a syllabus, or this is what we're covering, and also what the students are reading, what kind of assignments they will get. And that is the space at the very beginning of the year to push the teacher on, is there inclusion from September to June in the work you're doing? And then ask them, if there isn't, what kind of help do you need, right? The second thing is to really push and find out directly from principals and or social studies supervisors and English supervisors. Some schools don't have those, they will only have the principal and vice principal. Ask them what their, how do they assess,
I didn't see her.
specifically the inclusion. Right? Ask them how do they assess the inclusion. And they should have an answer.
Okay.
Someone needs to mute themselves. Sorry, Lillie.
That's all right. I think everyone heard me.
All right. Dr. Edwards, thank you so very, very much. I am super thrilled that we were able to capture this. I enjoyed your presentation tremendously. I want to continue the dialogue.
Tom, I'm sorry. I just thought of a better answer to the last question. And that is, I just remembered there are school districts like Hoboken where it was the superintendent who led, right, who led the work. I would suggest why one of the answers to the question may come from asking superintendents who, again, from that level are requiring it. How does she ensure that her requirements have filtered down to the classroom? Because my guess is, because this was her work, that she has some way of digging down deeply to making sure the district is carrying through her requirements as the superintendent. And it just occurred to me, asking somebody who is at that level, who is requiring the work, how does she get the feedback for her own teaching staff, right? Would be one strategy. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No problem at all.
Okay.
Lillie, thank you very much. Maybe there'll be a part 2 at some point in time. Smile. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been given some information that we need to use to implement Amistad. This is going to be posted on the webpage as soon as possible. And the Amistad Commission needs to know what your thoughts are about moving forward, especially your local school district needs to know what's going and how you can become effective in making it work. So I thank you all for joining us this evening. Let's carry the message. Dr. Edwards, again, I thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and stay in the struggle and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody.